But we would love to know a little bit more about who you are, what your background is. We know that you are a double demon, so you went to Nepal not once, twice. You liked it that much. So just tell us a little bit about your background and what your aspirations are at.
Yeah. Well, hi everybody. I know this is like where do I look, right? But no, you can see all angles. But hi everybody. My name is Rebecca Hernandez. I'm a search associate at Koya Partners Diversified Search Group, as Flavio and Annie and you all mentioned. But I feel like beyond that, right? I think if I'm sort of peeling the layers, right, of who we are and, how we present ourselves. I'd love to, because I was in the space before and also worked here before, share a little bit more about myself and who I am beyond just, my work title and who I am at work. I am a double demon. I'm a first generation Latina. Currently, and we're in the space that I am at is really at a little bit of crossroads. And I hope that this is, might resonate with some of you. And for some of you, it might resonate a little bit later, depending on where you are in your journey here at DePaul. But I think for me, as I was navigating, transitioning from I graduated from DePaul. I started working at DePaul as soon as I graduated from my undergrad. I spent 6 years in admissions and I did it all. I feel like I was so involved at DePaul. I was involved in the city. I was involved with CPS. I was involved with nonprofit organizations. Where there was space for me, I was there. And if there wasn't, pulled another table and grabbed a couple of chairs and, brought on my friends. And that's just sort of who I am and how I've navigated this world. But specifically in terms of my career that I want to focus on in a conversation today, and I think that, of course, I'll pull in layers of who I am as a person, but it's that I'm at a little bit of crossroads, right? I spent 6 years here, and then I think like many people, the pandemic hit, and I'm like, what is next? And it wasn't because I was trying to find out what is next immediately. It was that I spent 6 years at DePaul. I was reaching the peak of what I could do within admissions. I was at the highest point of admissions at that point within our office space. And I just knew that I had to take a new challenge. I kind of knew the ins and outs of DePaul. I feel like many of us, that are passionate about DePaul, we live and breathe DePaul. And so we feel like we know it like the back of our hands. We know everybody. You can go to like Joanna Dvorak's desk and her in her office and have a chat with her. You can go to the career center, you can meet with a child, all these people at DePaul, things that resonated with me. And I felt like I needed something new. I needed a new impact. And so I thought about what was next, and we'll talk a little bit more, I'm sure, of how I got there, but know that I was in a point in my life where, I had recently gotten married. There's so many changes in my life that I felt like I was at a point where, I feel lost, but I'm also really excited about what's next. I feel lost because I don't know where I'm going. I had so many ideas. I'm so involved, but I'm like, this feels overwhelming. And I coach students on how to get through this, but I myself was at this point where I now had to do some internal work. And then I was at the point of, you know what? Yeah, I'm actually looking for something new. Where do I get started? How do I even look within? And I feel like even though there might be some of you who are probably at different stages of what that question might be, I think it might resonate with a lot of you at different stages. But I hope that sort of slightly insight of what I was going through and how I was processing this next stage of my life is helpful. And I'm sure we'll uncover a little bit more about
it's
that.
Super helpful. And I think it's super interesting to give that perspective from someone who has been within higher ed for some time now. And you mentioned as a student, you were also very involved. So I would love to learn a little bit more about, what were those student organizations? You mentioned admissions as well, but what were those skills that you developed, those abilities that you gained that made you feel prepared to take that next step?
Yeah, so I was heavily involved in LTA, which is a Latina sorority here on campus. I'm still really involved as an alumna, and that gave me a space. I think we talk about this, and I appreciate DePaul's sort of recognition of this, right? But in a predominantly white institution, having spaces where I could be myself, I could talk about, hey, I'm lost, and I'm lost because I knew to get involved, and I was involved in that space that gave me an opportunity to find other women that were just as passionate about making a difference in this world, not only at DePaul, but really just overall. But then also that looked like me, right? I was in classroom spaces like this where, I felt people didn't understand that although my mind was here and I was focused, on my work at DePaul, I was constantly thinking about like how my mom was going to get home, what my siblings were doing, what is my husband doing? Like so many layers of your life as a first generation student impacted just the way that I processed, the way that I moved through DePaul. That for me, it was never just one thing that I was thinking about. So LTA was sort of my like space of community, my space of vulnerability. But then it was also the space of like, push yourself. There's other women that are doing phenomenal things. And how can you find that group that then puts you into a network of so many other Latina leaders in Chicago? And that's really how I branched out beyond just DePaul. The Career Center was a key space for me. It was a safe space also, but it was a space where I could be vulnerable enough to ask questions about, I really needed to process from beginning to end, right? Some of my siblings didn't finish college. My mom and my dad both had, entry-level jobs. So what questions do I ask? How do I even, continue building my resume? What type of internships do I seek? So the Career Center was really pivotal in that. And then so was mission and ministry. So I was heavily involved in that. I was a student leader. I worked in the office as an intern. I led a lot of service immersion trips. And those were, I think, the three key organizations outside of admissions that really gave me the tools. And then within those, 4 spaces, I really made sure to connect with staff that either had a similar experience to me when they were going to college, but also staff that didn't and that were comfortable enough where I could go to them and ask questions from beginning to end about, I don't know what I'm doing here, to they really pushed me towards the end of my time here at DePaul to say, like, you're going to do great things. They were the ones that sent the recommendation letters. They were the ones that, gave me all the awards and recognitions that I've received or, nominated me for those things. So I think ultimately it was that I took advantage of the spaces that were available for me. And then from then I found people, I found my community. I built that outside of just my peers. I built that of people that could push me to be more than what I even thought I could be in a safe space.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then it just gets me thinking, like, if you could narrow it down to 2 or 3, like, what were those main skills that made you feel empowered to reach out, to seek out opportunities? Like, what were those abilities that you were implementing?
Yeah.
And do you still find yourself using them and empowering yourself in your current role with those skills?
I think one is they push me to always be a student, always seek to learn and ask questions, and never take that as, I think for some it's a sense of vulnerability, right? Because you feel like at any point you have to know everything that you're doing, or and I felt like they were comfortable enough and shared with me that the best leaders ask the right questions, and then allow others to be vulnerable enough to ask questions too. That was one. Second, I think it also taught me to be myself, right? Your biggest power is you. For so many years, especially at the beginning of my time here at DePaul, I felt, I was trying to, look at my peers and I'm like, the girl that like, gets all the A's and, was like, always had the best questions, and like, the professor always looked to her to, answer the questions. And I'm like, what is she doing? Like, what am I not doing? I would be in networking spaces and there were so many people that already knew the ins and outs. They could walk into a space and they had connections to everybody. And I felt that I had to look within and find what were my skill sets. So that was, using the Career Center, taking advantage of all the assessments that are free to students, because those are not free, and are very expensive when you graduate. So those assessments then really helped me define in written form my strengths, but then also be able to verbalize those, right? In conversations, at networking events. That was really key. So I knew who I was internally. I'm comfortable with myself, but then I was able to verbalize that both, verbally, but then also written, which for, to be very transparent in the spaces that I'm in now, that's key, right? In order to be able to write effectively, efficiently, to demonstrate strength in that space is really important. And I felt that was something that I didn't really hone in as much at the beginning, but I did later on in my career. And I think the last one was to really take time to give myself grace and take it day by day, right? That at each space, every single either setback or new opportunity, person that I met, there was a reason why I was meeting them. There was a reason why I was in that space. And I feel like taking advantage sounds so bad. Okay, it's a negative connotation, like you're taking advantage of it. But no, really being intentionally present and then seeing, okay, what am I gaining from this experience? But also in a very DePaul way, what am I giving, right? To this space, to this person, or to this opportunity. So those, I think, were the top three that I got from my experience.
Yeah, that's some great advice. I definitely see how students can learn from that and implement that on their own. Yeah, absolutely. And then you mentioned, as a first generation student as well, I empathize with that kind of like not knowing what to do, right? Or like not knowing who to go to. So I'm curious in like who were your role models, or who were those people that kind of inspired you? You said, well, that girl in your class, like, I want to be like her. But like I'm curious to learn a little bit more.
Oh my God, so many people. I think ultimately here at DePaul, I think many students, and maybe for those of you that are watching this, if you haven't met, Joanna, please do so. Joanna Dvorak. She was phenomenal. She really helped me stay true to myself, no matter how high I got, or the next award that I received. I always had her in the back of my mind. I think about other people here, Georgie, right, who is a fearless leader, is so committed to breaking barriers, walking the walk and the talk, and then bringing people with her. That's so key and so important. And then I had to step away from DePaul. I really did. I had to step out and see, okay, what are the other, change makers, who's disrupting the system, who else is, making a difference in different spaces, right? But specifically in spaces that I wanted to be a part of. And some of that, ended up being friends, so sorority sisters. Some of them also ended up being like leaders. So I reached out to specifically one of the board members at Latinos Progresando. I, attended networking events with ASE. I, ended up connecting with someone at Chicago Booth, the University of Chicago Booth, and they have a really strong like DEI program. So even in spaces where I may not have used, right, I wasn't getting a certificate at Booth, but just the fact that I was connecting with people in that space made it so valuable for me. So those are some of the names that come to mind when I think about people that were really making a difference in my life in a point of transition. Those were some of them, beyond just, I think, my family, who at the end of the day, I could come home and, they were sort of the roots and could ground me a little bit, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I think it's super helpful as well to consider like, the people you meet change as you develop and as you gain new experiences. So I would love to kind of have you walk us through that career change from DePaul to Koya Partners. You mentioned a few people that helped you and inspired you, but while you were transitioning, like, how did you set your mind on recruiting? Did you think about other spaces to look into? I'd just like to learn a little bit more about that transition process.
Yeah, so for everybody listening, I think one of the biggest things that I learned at DePaul, and beyond, which I think was the most important, was really trying to ensure that, asking the question of what must be done, as silly as sometimes it may seem that we continuously bring it up. I really did I want to live that out intentionally, right? Is that I always want to think about the spaces that I'm at, even today, right? Being like, well, Flavia, we have to connect after this, right? Like I always think about intentionally being in spaces. And so when I think about my time at DePaul, just I do have to backtrack a little bit. My last 2 years, I think it was important that I was in a space where I just took advantage of anything that came my way. I was like an open book, from a service immersion trip to an assessment. And then from the assessments, I was like, okay, these are all of the organizations that, I think would align best for me. I'm just going to go and I'm going to go on, like our internship portal. And then I'm going to look to see if there's any internships available. Like, it's sort of like really sequential. And I'm like, okay, I got this. Now I'm going to go here. And I find that to be important just because so often I was like, wow, I took a step back and I said, I wish, even though I took advantage of a lot, I wish I could have taken advantage of more. And I think you don't see how much access is available to you until you step out of it, right? So I know you hear this from tons of flyers. I know you probably hear it from career center folks to your professors to, maybe probably mentors. But I really do believe that if you can be an open book and allow yourself to be vulnerable and accept and take advantage of the resources that are here, they're going to be key to your transition. The way that I got to spending 6 years in admissions was I actually worked initially as a student ambassador. I was really involved in high school and a lot of, freshman connecting with first year students and trying to make them feel comfortable in high school. So I just felt it made sense to be that when I got here to DePaul. I will say, and I'm very transparent about this, one of my brother's friends knew someone within admissions. And the reason why I say that is because it echoes this idea of, I don't believe in that it's just only who you know, but I do think that there's value in who you know. And so when I got accepted to DePaul, I felt like I blasted it. And I was like, anybody who can connect me to anyone within DePaul, I will take advantage of that. So even to those who might be listening, even staying connected to your DePaul recruiter, right? To your counselor is key because we can connect you to the rest of DePaul. And so I knew that my next step in admissions was going to be that. I transitioned, I took advantage of a lot of networking opportunities and professional development opportunities. So here, I took advantage of the diversity certificate. I took advantage of being a part of higher ed spaces, right? So networking spaces within higher ed. I took advantage of, some additional professional development, like the Chicago quarter here at DePaul. So I was staff, I was getting paid for another job, and I was also adding a new skill set to my resume, right? So I think finding ways that I thought of, how do I use the resources that are available at DePaul as staff, truthfully have someone else pay for, these professional development experiences. How do I make it work for myself while also thinking about what's next for me, right? Because I knew that this wasn't going to be the only space that I was going to be in. So those are some of the things that I took advantage of when I was a staff member here. And then I stayed connected really intentionally with people here. So I was involved in, several committees, the Undocumented Student Committee, the Hispanic Serving Institute Task Force. I was involved in, events with the Career Center, with other organizations across DePaul. And I did that just because I firmly believe that people will remember the time that you give them, even if you can give them anything else, because time is so valuable. We don't really have it. I think all of us are so busy that I felt that if I could just give my time to a staff member, give my time to an organization, whether that was like an email was pushing up, anything that I was doing, staying connected within DePaul was still important, because at the end of the day, we are all still humans. Yeah. We're probably also still looking for your next, transition as well. So there were spaces within DePaul, but then there were spaces outside of DePaul during my time there. To get to the latter point of your question, how I then got to thinking about Koya is, I mentioned being at crossroads, and I got to my 6 years. And I want to be transparent about some of these questions and thought processes that we have, because I felt that when I graduated initially and I got a new job, everything felt perfect. And I was like, I have my job, I got a great salary, I have everything I wanted, I was getting married, all the things. It was just checking the boxes.
Yeah.
And then when I got to my 6 years, I'm like, how do you look for another job? Like, how do you transition? Like, okay, I graduated again. Like, how do you do all this again? Even when I had this vast network, right? It's just getting to that point again where I felt like a student all over again. And I accepted that. And so I used LinkedIn 1,000%. I leveraged that. I took advantage of all of the, again, free as an alumni, the like LinkedIn training that we have access to. And I'm like, I am intentionally, taking some assessments, but then also looking at what are other spaces that I want to be a part of. So higher ed can sometimes feel you're within higher ed, you're kind of staying in that sector. But I was very passionate about DEI work within DePaul as an admissions counselor and then an associate director. I was always leading our mission initiative. So anytime when it came to working with our multicultural students, with our CBOs, with our first gen students, I led that full initiative for all first year students. So I knew that I wanted to be in that DEI space. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it, but I knew I wanted to be in that DEI space. So I used LinkedIn, I leveraged LinkedIn, and I started talking to recruiters. I did the whole like open to work, it was like, I'm putting myself out there. And it was a time where everybody was doing it.
Yeah.
So I felt like, how do I set myself apart? So I actually met with a career advisor and I was like, how do I leverage my LinkedIn? I feel like I'm doing it right. And then we're like, you could use some work. So it was like, then they, critiquing, critical feedback, and constructive feedback that was then given to me about my LinkedIn, had someone completely change my resume. And then I met with a career advisor outside of DePaul and had some other assessments. And they were like, these are sort of the 5 different career areas we think you'd be really strong in. But of course, you have transferable skills that can really take you in many different spaces. So I found Koya because they were one of the recruiters that I had actually connected with. And I had initially connected with them about a totally different job. But as a search associate, they reached out to me and they were like, hey, based on your background, based on just your initial conversation that we had, not even related to this job, we'd love the opportunity to connect with you further. I had applied to jobs at Google. I had applied to jobs at United. I had applied to jobs at, large non-for-profits, banks, all of it. And I would get callbacks, but none of them felt right. I think like many people during the start of the pandemic, I didn't want to make just any move. I wanted it to feel right. Truthfully, the money also had to be there. I was making a really big move at a very critical point in my life. And I think as first generation students, sometimes we're taught to not prioritize the money over the way that you're going to feel at your job or what it's going to give you. And I felt like I wanted to accept that both of those were important values to me. And then, we had thorough conversations. I actually took some time and asked them to give me a full week to look through their website, talk to other staff members within the organization so I could learn more about them. I've never gone corporate.
Yeah.
So that was a really big question for me. So all of those things that I was processing were questions that the Career Center helped me get to. And then that LinkedIn leverage, right? Looking at postings and assessments. Those were some of the key things that got me to that point. And then of course our conversation can dive further about what I'm doing there now,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
That's how I got to that initial finding of Koya Partners initially.
Yeah, and then you mentioned all of these skill sets that you gained from those experiences, and how can you use those skills to describe what you're doing right now? Like, can you kind of break it down to us? What are those skills that you do on your day-to-day functions? yeah, I'm just curious
Yeah.
about that.
Oh my God.
Specifically within
So many,
DEI
I've never
recruiting.
really thought that, I felt very confident coming from higher ed and with a DePaul education that I could go anywhere. And I want to be vulnerable enough to share that it has been hard. Pivoting to a whole new sector is difficult. It is not easy. But the skills that I had, which were one, I had the communication skills that were essential for this role, right? I know how to connect with people. I know the questions to ask to get to what I need from them, right? In this specific role, right? As a search associate, what I'm doing is, and specifically not only a search associate for just any role, we specialize on CEO recruitment. So this is the highest level of leadership at nonprofits, in nonprofits. And for some, and maybe if you are listening, you thought like me, I'm a recruiter, I know how to do this. Well, this level of recruitment is more intentional. It's also more detailed and has a lot of players that are involved. So it's not only that I'm on LinkedIn and looking for, 10, 15 candidates. It is that we are actually meeting with committees, so like board members that are leading the search for this CEO. We're having multiple communications with staff members. We're, sending surveys out, like what do you want from this next CEO? It's very intentional. And then we kind of have a 5-stage process. But the one that I want to specifically focus on is our mitigating bias training, which we provide to the committees. So we do this to say, we're really intentional about the way that we recruit. We are looking at quality, skills, and characteristics of candidates. We're not just looking at them checking boxes. And we're also going to help train you so we can minimize any bias that might come into play when you are reviewing a resume or meeting with candidates. And that was key for me. Once I found out that my role was going to be leading that training, looking for candidates, which, I specialize in, leading that training, which I've done within my time as an assistant director here at DePaul within admissions. And then the final skill set was that I do think that DePaul taught me, based on our mission, to really see the human dignity in people. So I wanted to intentionally pull people beyond just their resume, that they had a story to tell, that they were more than just, the budget that they oversaw or, the number of staff members. That they had a story to tell within their transitions and how they navigated from, their first role to their second to their third. And those were I think the 3 key skill sets. The last one that I think I learned, and I challenged myself to do so, was writing in a business format is very different than writing for parents and for students. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just a different way of communicating. And so I had to really change that. And look at, I remember going on my Google Drive and looking at my old essays and just being like, oh my God, I used to write so differently before. And then I did that, and I was passionate about that. And I share that because I hope that people that are listening can think about the things that they enjoy most. And sometimes they're going to be things that you do in your day-to-day at DePaul. Sometimes they're going to be things that you do in your downtime. And how can you bridge those skill sets? So I think I had an opportunity to combine both interests and skill sets.
So then just kind of taking that, it sounds like you do a lot, right? It's like, to someone who's not very familiar, it sounds like, how are you doing all of this, right? So like, what's kind of your day-to-day? Do you work in the office? Do you work hybrid? Do you collaborate with your team? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So it's an exciting time. I was mentioning to Flavio, and for those of you that are listening, I like to share my title just because I do think that when you are looking at LinkedIn or when you're thinking about, jobs, consulting kind of sort of comes up depending on the spaces that you're in. And so technically it is a consulting role. My day-to-day looks different every day, but there are some key things that I do very intentionally and on a day-to-day basis. We are in a hybrid model. So, we are in the office, 2 days a week, and then the other days we're still at home, which I'm really, privileged to have that opportunity to do that. But my day-to-day really looks very intentionally. So one, it is a heavy load. So I am, for the most part, working through about 8 to 9 searches since I started. 8 to 9 searches, and think of this as large CEO searches at a time. So that means that what I'm doing is one very basic, you're looking at my calendar, ensuring that all of our meetings with each committee, they're being scheduled, that we're following up via email. So that's more on the logistics side of things. So there's logistics that are heavily involved within this role. And then the second is more of the strategy piece, which is, okay, we've narrowed down the quality, skills, and characteristics that we want for each one of these roles via surveys with staff, communicating with the community, depending on the type of role that it is, meeting with the board, meeting with leadership team. And now that we have that, we all can agree on these quality, skills, and characteristics, then yes, I'm on LinkedIn and I'm looking for new leaders. And I say this because it's special. I take this a great pride, but it's also an honor to say, I am looking for people, one, that may not look like the current CEO, right? CEOs currently are very male dominant, white spaces. And so the fact that I have the privilege to now look for candidates that maybe have gaps in their resume, have, changes in their, careers, and I am presenting them as a viable candidate for said role is a lot of responsibility, and I don't take that lightly. So I'm really intentional about the research that I do on LinkedIn. But then outside of that is the great part is that, similar to I think why people look at like a Google or, a Facebook, a Meta, is that we also have a strong network, right? We have a strong network of leaders across Chicago. I go to networking spaces all the time where people know my boss and are in love with her, and are like, this woman has like matched so many people, has placed so many CEOs in the city of Chicago and nationwide. They're doing really great work. So then it's the network that we already have. How can I tap into that to get, these additional candidates? And then I think the final one is really looking at, internally, right? How are we ensuring that we're also communicating and looking at candidates that we maybe have talked to before, that could be really strong for, our search. So trying not to reinvent the wheel, but always ensuring that we are on top of new and rising leaders across the nation, and then those that have been within our network for quite some time. And I think it's an important role to play. It comes with a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of excitement. I'm excited for the new leaders that are coming up in Chicago and across the nation. I think it's a time where there's a lot of transitions in high leadership positions, and I think they're paving the way for us to think differently about who gets to those roles. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It makes me feel glad. It makes me feel relieved that, there's someone advocating for that, and that it means so much to you, because you're right. This is going to be the future. Demographics are changing. Our needs are changing. And I think it's super important to have someone in a position where they can influence that and can understand what people want to see. So that's super exciting. And I'm going to take the last few minutes now to kind of open it up to anyone on Zoom. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. And then Sierra and Ellie is going to keep an eye out on the chat. And if not, we can just keep chatting the last 15 minutes. Yeah, this is super interesting.
And then open it up to anybody.
Yes.
No question is a silly question. I'm also totally okay with any earlier for us to keep chatting, and I'll share my LinkedIn as well if you all are
Absolutely
comfortable sharing that out. I know I'm a processor, so I don't always have questions immediately, and I might, then I follow up with somebody, via email or via LinkedIn. So completely understand if there's people who take more time to process. But whether it's questions about my career, my time here at DePaul as a student, first generation, all of
drop it in the chat.
Yes.
Takes a second to type. So we'll see.
While folks are kind of formulating their thoughts, I'll just add that, first of all, thank you for allowing us to share your contact information, because again, some folks might think of things after the fact. And Rebecca, you mentioned some really great resources, both in the Chicagoland community and on campus. So just so you folks in the room, that sounds so silly to say, but in the room now, we'll type up a little write-up, probably within the next few business days, so maybe not over the weekend, so that you all can explore those, like the Demon Discounts page, that's a gold mine. So
Oh my God.
we'll share what Rebecca has referenced with you all, just so you don't remember that off the top of your head, but thank you for bringing all those up.
Yeah, absolutely. I want more information on that DEI certificate.
Yeah.
I remember you
I
mentioned
got,
that.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
and I
got
was
you,
like,
I can send that
completely
out too,
forgot
yeah.
about that. That was a thing. It's like a
Yes.
program, right?
Uh-huh.
It's added in your tuition.
Yeah. There's some, yeah,
Like-
it's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so good. So
Rebecca, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, let me just read this from the chat. It says, I don't have any questions, but I love your story. As a Latina myself, you give me inspiration to look for opportunities in furthering my career. Oh, yes.
so much. We appreciate that.
We appreciate Rebecca. And that kind of like goes into like what I was going to ask as well is for any student who were some like tips or recommendations that you'll give for students who it sounds like you had so much like and you just put yourself out there, but let's say a student's more just like shy or nervous or reserved and don't have, aren't connected with one of their teachers or faculty or their advisor. Like what are some suggestions that you have for them to either get out of their comfort zone or to get those opportunities if they're just like at the level one base starting off trying to network and advance their career?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. And I think though I'm here and I present as an extrovert. I'm really more introverted. But that might be just a Gemini in me, but the the one thing that I wanted to make mention to answer your questions here is that I think I would recommend to find one. I think that internal work is really important. So for some reason, I think back to my junior year of being an IB student in high school and having this one teacher who said, like, whenever you feel anything, and the best way to learn something new, so both of those things, is to write, right? To use your skill set, like just write. And so I do think that there's a little bit of internal work that has to happen about like just taking time for yourself. So writing about like, what are you enjoying at DePaul? Like, how are you feeling? What are all the things that are impacting your day to day? Like, what excited you about your day today? What made you smile? So like doing some of that internal work, I think is important because you can have so much support, but I think internal work is important, and being comfortable with yourself and at peace with yourself is key, and it's a journey. But then the second thing I would say is I would just ask to give yourself grace, that it's okay to be shy. But if there's one person that I can say, just your task, keep them small and attainable, right? Those SMART goals, is if you can say, okay, this month I want to give myself the grace and want to it's okay to get uncomfortable, to say either I'm gonna, put my professor, aside and schedule a one-on-one conversation with them. So I'm gonna reach out via Blue Star to schedule an appointment with them or with my advisor. And that way it's a one-on-one space, but it's also like you've planned it, but you've given yourself some time so that you can process what you want to ask. Even if you don't know what to ask. All of us as staff and faculty here at DePaul have been in your shoes, and I felt that that's what I had to remember, is that I can go into a space and say, I'm completely lost. I don't know where to begin. I may need some help. And some of the questions that they might ask you will help then, get you to that next step. But if you can lean on just one person that brings you that comfort or gives you that sense of like, maybe I don't want to like be like just them, right? But there's some skills that they have that I don't, and how did they get that, or how did they get there? That would be my first step. Just because I think that it's important when people around you are aware of or can direct you to people or spaces that might benefit you. And having someone that can be a safe space is really key here. And they're then gonna, connect you elsewhere. But that would be my first my first one, just because I do think that if you keep trying to just figure it out on your own, it can get lonely.
It's hard, yeah.
It's hard, and you don't have to do this alone. I think that that's important to remind our students about.
Super important. Yeah, I like that mention of working on yourself, right? Like being comfortable with yourself. And I always say that when I advise students as well, because they're always like, oh, I'm so nervous, like I don't have the skills, I don't have experience. And then like I start talking to them and they tell me all these great things that they've done and all these things that they know. And I'm like, you have so much to offer. You just have to be confident in your ability and the way that you present yourself, and like, you can exude that energy and people will believe you, and then you'll start to believe it yourself. And I think it's kind of like a domino effect, but it definitely starts from within and feeling like you can do certain things, right?
And I think it's also helpful that for people to help you learn how to talk about those things, right? Because you might know you have those skill sets. You're like, oh my God, yes, I do. But then it goes beyond going a step further and saying like, okay, how am I using my illustration skills, my, passion for animation or my passion for graphic design? I use that a lot of the skill sets that I learned in my like 2 computing and digital media classes here at DePaul. I use it every single day. When I'm on Adobe, I'm like, oh my God, when I'm building position profiles, I'm like, who would have thought that I'd have these skill sets, right? And some people that I meet, a lot of students that I met, they might think that, here I'm just focusing on like the arts, right? But they might think that those skills are, not as important or not as talked about as, skill sets that are as transferable or as needed. But as we move into a very like technology driven space, those are key. Creativity is key, right? I think it's just more of sometimes students can struggle, and I, as an adult, still do, struggling with how can you identify those and break those down into key words that either you're going to use in your resume, you're going to use when you're connecting with recruiters or in your interview, that are going to set you apart from others.
And to that, I would always just suggest, taking the effort to read through job descriptions, pay attention to like the language that they use, right? Like not literally, but how do they speak about experiences? How do they speak about qualifications? And I think that is all very helpful to learn how to speak about yourself. Like when it's time to start applying.
Yeah.
But definitely. Yes. Hello. How's it going?
I was gonna say, Rebecca, you did this so well, but to your point, Flavio, how do you connect the skills that you possess in conversation to the job you want to do? And so you just provided us with a great example of that. Okay, I'm great at Adobe or I'm great at graphic design. We're very happy for you. That's wonderful. How is that going to connect to where you want to go? And you provided a really nice connect the dots sentence, as I call them. So that's something that you're right. It takes a lot of practice. And I don't think you don't ever arrive at a place where you're excellent at, especially here in the Midwest, maybe bragging about yourself, right? So it can take some practice. And I know, Flavio, you did a little bit of that even today. You were talking about like interview preparation, or even just how do I talk about myself? We can do that in the Career Center, but you mentioned some other advocates or partners that you can use too. It could be a friend, it could be a classmate, it could be someone from your church or synagogue or whatever it is. But just voicing that, or like you said, writing it down, creating an illustration that demonstrates that, whatever works for you to process that is kind of getting you to that next step, right? Where, oh my gosh, I'm in an interview and I need to talk about this. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
Definitely.
At some point, I think, recorded myself. And when I see this recording, you'll know one of the things that I've always had to work on is I am like full blown facial expressions. Like you cannot change that. I've tried, I've taken so many classes. It's just that is literally who I am. And I think that there are some things where you're just like, this is truly, when I'm in an interview, of course, my eyebrows aren't always like racing and like it's just, but it's who you are. And I, at some point I remember, I don't know if it's required yet, but it used to be required that you had to take a public speaking class here at DePaul. And I don't know if it was just for communications major, which I was formerly a communications major, but she had us record ourselves, right? So I'll see this recording, but she had us record ourselves. She's like, for some, this is going to be very difficult to watch. This exercise is not easy for everybody. And when I had that experience, when I recorded myself, you know, I did my whole like monologue basically, and then took time to see it, and I'm like, yeah, pause at like 2 minutes. And I'm like, I can't do this. Like, this is enough. And then I came back. And so the great thing is that it was more of like a 360 review. So I reviewed myself, my you know, the professor did it, and then a peer did it. And that was such a great space to be in, because vulnerable enough to one, record yourself and then be able to share that with other people. So I wasn't just the one seeing that, but then helpful enough that they created a space where we could help each other, right? We could learn. It was constructive feedback, but I share the recording yourself because it's helpful. You'll learn, you know, the words that you repeat, your mannerisms, you know, how you present yourself. And the more that you can be okay with that, you're not gonna, you know, there's no getting to a perfect point, but there's a getting to a point where, hey, maybe what you're trying to say, you know, you can get there here, 5 to 10 seconds quicker. And that will I think take you to greater spaces and open more opportunities for you. So that's a little nugget.
It all goes back to like upskilling and, you know, doing that self-reflection and